I have no responsibility for the current.
Stop lying!
So for what it's worth, I mean, it's such a chaotic scene right now. It seems like, intentionally, obviously it's only going to get worse with the election coming up. I still, I don't follow very many people anymore. I just follow like 22. If I follow somebody, I trust them, as far as like I know, as much as it depends on my knowledge and sense of things. That it's not that I agree with everything that person says necessarily, but that person they are who they say they are. They are authentic. If, I admit that I'm biased because I know that, especially Jonathan Engler, I know him well. So, and have, for a year plus. So, if Jonathan Engler turns out to be, something that he's not, or some kind of manipulator, I mean, I would be devastated. I would be absolutely devastated, and probably, quit this whole thing and be like, okay, then I don't know anybody. Then I can't tell anything. So that doesn't mean that you have to see it the same way. Martin's saying, like, as far as I know, Martin and Norman Fenton are putting, they put their Substacks over the past 4 years into a book. I've read I skimmed the book, and the chapter, or excuse me, that paper that they, that Jonathan and Martin just wrote, where they included your work, it's going into that book. And content that I wrote with them is going into that book. Martin's in the academic world. He was finishing marking up papers this week. So, and he does play things a little closer to the vest, right? That is the way he is on social media. But my experiences with him have been very good. So yeah, if those guys are like playing me or using me, or who knows, right? Again, I don't know what to say, but I would continue, if I can't tell you what to do, but I would continue to I recommend giving them the benefit of the doubt until there's really, really good reason not to. Catherine Watson, interesting one for me. I mean, I replied to her on Sage Hannah's Substack. I actually blocked Sage Hannah, but because he, told me he didn't care if I got shot in the head or, some kind of crazy nonsense. I have no idea who runs that Substack. I think Catherine's legitimate. I don't understand the role of Sasha Latipova 100%, but I've been honest about that with people about what I think is going on there. Again, head down. I'm really trying to focus on what I'm doing and what I do well as much as possible, because I believe that will bring the best result. And you've been really formative, for me, and I think a lot of other people, and you've taken the hits, not just with the clone stuff or the possibilities of, building a biological bridge there with the clone, but you've been helpful in helping people see who some of these players really are. I think that in some ways is probably your best, biggest contribution. And I've tried to honor that and cite you where and when I can. So, I only know who I am, and I'm legit. Okay, have a good day.
I'm not sure exactly who he is. His name is JJCouey, and I believe he's a consultant for CHD, and I believe he has a PhD in some sort of scientific discipline, from what I understand.
How do you think they live with themselves at this point when they just lie again and again, and we have the internet to expose the lies? If this isn't 20 years ago when you were on CNN, and we couldn't expose things. We can expose it now, and they still do it.
Well, I guess I would ask myself, like, I mean, I lie. If I'm really cornered or something, I lie. I really try not to. I try never to lie on TV. I just don't, I don't like lying. I certainly do it, out of weakness or whatever.
Your latest video with Paul was amazing, JJ. Really,
wow, that's a very nice compliment. Thank you very much. Can you hear me better now or not?
Yes, much better.
Okay, good.
It was really like it nailed down two things for me, but I finally really understand the infectious clone idea. And I think it's very, very likely what happened.
But you can tell if someone's lying, you can sort of feel it in people. And I have lied. I'm sure I'll lie again. I don't want to lie, I don't think I'm a liar. I try not to be a liar. I don't want to be a liar. I think it's like really important not to be a liar.
There are no ethics. There are no ethical boundaries to what they will do. It is all about the utilitarian means justify the ends.
Specialization should make you suspicious. Because if it's gotten harder to evaluate what's going on, then it's presumably gotten easier for people to lie and to exaggerate, and then one should be a little bit suspicious, and that's sort of my starting bias. Specialization should make you suspicious. Because if it's gotten harder to evaluate what's going on, then it's presumably gotten easier for people to lie and to exaggerate, and then one should be a little bit suspicious, and that's sort of my starting bias. Specialization should make you suspicious. Because if it's gotten harder to evaluate what's going on, then it's presumably gotten easier for people to lie and to exaggerate, and then one should be a little bit suspicious, and that's sort of my starting bias.
Condition that we will not call autism. I don't like the word autism. He was vaccine damaged. He was neurologically damaged. Condition that we will not call autism. I don't like the word autism. He was vaccine damaged. Condition that we will not call autism. I don't like the word autism. He was vaccine damaged.
I'm not sure exactly who he is. His name is JJCouey, and I believe he's a consultant for CHD, and I believe he has a PhD in some sort of scientific discipline, from what I understand.
He was vaccine damaged.
It doesn't matter much at all what you believe about vaccines until we invent really important ones, until we have a pandemic that's killing everyone, and, it's measles plus, okay, I can tolerate what you think about measles because, not that many people die from it. It's just a big hassle in the end. But no, when we have this new pandemic that is, got 75% mortality and there'll be no pretense of being polite in the face of these beliefs. It'll be a moral emergency because it has to be.
It's like Jay said, the RNA can't pandemic. It can't. And there's no reason to discuss this anymore because it's clear. And if it's clear, we shouldn't waste time talking about it. It's like Jay said, the RNA can't pandemic. It can't. And there's no reason to discuss this anymore because it's clear. And if it's clear, we shouldn't waste time talking about it.
Actually, JJCouey's insistence, and I think he's right, on calling them transfections rather than vaccines.
I think truth is good for kids. We're so busy lying, we don't even recognize the truth no more in society. We want everybody to feel good. That's not the way life is.
He introduced Jonathan, who's going to talk about his latest kind of distillation of what the pandemic means to society, to biology, to science, and to democracy, and to the whole kind of idea of empiricism and integrity. And then each of us, this incredible preeminent panel that we have, each one of you is going to get a chance to comment on his thesis. I wanted to bring everybody together because I've read Jonathan's thoughts about this. He's one of the most thoughtful critics of the pandemic management from the beginning. He was one of the co-founders of RASTIC, which was the Organization of Independent Scientists all over the world. Particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, did really wonderful work in understanding the science, in unearthing scientific studies that made a lot of this stuff comprehensible. And he's also been instrumental in uncovering some of the involvement of the intelligence agencies and others in the management of the pandemic, and also the long history of what we call gain-of-function science.
On every slide, the first slide I have quotes, and I know that you don't read them at all because you don't need to read them to pass and get a good grade. But this one is pretty cool. The quote from Alice in Wonderland. "One can't believe impossible things," said Alice. "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." So that's totally suitable for this lecture. A lot of impossible things are going to happen today.
It's literally turning into worst case scenario. The latest data tells us that we're dealing with essentially a worst case scenario. I'm afraid that the latest data tells us that we're dealing with essentially a worst case scenario. I'm afraid that the latest data tells us that we're dealing with essentially a worst case scenario. I'm afraid that the latest data tells us that we're dealing with essentially a worst case scenario. I'm afraid that the latest data tells us that we're dealing with.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show. This is Gigaohm Biological, a high-resistance, low-noise information brief brought to you by a biologist where we're seeking the truth together. Again, welcome to the show. My name, is Jonathan Couey. I'm chief biologist at Gigaohm Biological. I come to you live out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the back of my garage. Those photos were taken when I was still an academician at the time in Norway. There you can see my inverted image in the eye of a halibut recently caught by myself. Anyway, if you want to find my long track record as an academagician, you can look on the National Library of Medicine's website, PubMed. Search for my last name, Couey, my first initials, JJ, in that search bar, and you will find all the publications associated with my work, including the one that got me involved in that group called Drastic, which, of course, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., being on a national security script, agreed was a great group of, scientists and smart people whistleblowing on a gain-of-function virus leak, which, of course, is a national security narrative based in no real biology. I've tried to explain this at least 3 times to the group called Panda, based out of South Africa. However, they lost all 3 of those presentations, and instead people like Germ Warfare and Nick Hudson and Jonathan Engler have been masquerading as people with meaningful ideas and meaningful insight, usually by pirating some small fractured piece of my ideas or my wordage, my verbiage. I've presented to the NCI, but of course that's a ridiculous organization who has no message and has done no summary. I presented actually to the steering committee, or whatever they were called, of the wellness company. They offered me sponsorship a few times through a couple of their people, including Paul Alexander. I always turned it down. I've worked for Children's Health Defense. I didn't turn them down. I also did not turn Robert F. Kennedy Jr. down when he asked me to help him write his book. However, in the process of writing that book, I also taught myself enough biology to know that RNA cannot pandemic, and tried to teach everybody involved with that book that was true. And unfortunately, that didn't matter, because the goal was to get me to be the guy that, could go on podcasts and tell everybody all about how there was a lab leak and they covered it up. Instead, I went on the Red Pill Expo and told everybody that I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a scripted liar, and I think behind him are people like Robert Malone and Kevin McKernan of the Human Genome Project and of DITRA, respectively. And unfortunately, that message went nowhere. And so now I've been practicing basketball for the last year or so, trying to get my 53-year-old butt back in shape so that I can teach biology from the hardwood. And maybe somewhere along the way we'll meet some patriots in America who are interested in dispelling the mythology that is public health and our ridiculous vaccine schedule in America, and dispelling the mythology behind the fake health freedom movement of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the ridiculous people that are propped up on podcasts all around the internet. We know how this works. This is the way it works. Ladies and gentlemen, RNA cannot pandemic, intramuscular injection is dumb, transfection is a crime, and population pyramids are real. If you like what you hear, or like what you hear in the next 2 hours or so, please go to gigaohmbiological.com, find a way to support the work. If you haven't already, download the PeerTube app and then direct that app to stream.gigaohm.bio as a platform. And then all of my work will be instantly on your phone with no personal data shared. One of the best ways to be on the internet without using corporate social media, which is, of course, a military social control suite. It is definitely a trap. So get you and your kids out.
I don't care how you get there. I don't care what you do to get there. The goal is to win.
What time is it? Game time! Woo!
the fruitless searches. Oh, I see the light and the heat. Oh, I wanna be that complete. I wanna touch the light, the heat I see in your eyes. I don't like to see so much pain, so much wasted, and this moment keeps slipping away. I get so tired working so hard for our survival. I look to the time with you to keep me awake and alive. And all my instincts, they return, and the grand facade so soon will burn. Without a noise, without my pride, I reach out from the inside. The heat, your eyes, I am complete. Your eyes, I see the doorway, a thousand churches. Your eyes, the resolution. Your eyes, of all the fruitless searches. Oh, I see the light and the heat. Oh, I wanna be that complete. I wanna touch the light, the heat I see in your eyes, in your eyes, in your eyes, in your eyes.
Good evening, ladies. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good to see everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for being here. There are few things more dishonorable than misleading the young, and make no mistake about it, by very careful military scripted design. We are essentially on the same team as the Soph character that played a role in Alex Jones' show in 2019, and Robert Malone. We are on the same team as these people by script, and they are all actually traitors to our children. And here you can see Brett Weinstein admitting that this is potentially the scripted end of the West. And he is, of course, a part of this, connected through his brother and Peter Thiel and their father, who's directly connected to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s dad. And, of course, the probably murdered Estes Kefauver, who nobody wants to talk about, and that alone is an admission. They can only make admissions after many years of lies. Kevin McKernan being at the center of many of these things. Kevin McKernan...
Ralph Barrick's the guy who arguably taught with...
Kevin McKernan would not otherwise exist if it wasn't for me. Someone else would be doing what he's done, and this November 2024 podcast, where he essentially admits that there is a script behind Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Jay Bhattacharya that he is involved in. And the fact of the matter goes that his father already was involved in microwave technology, probably one of the reasons that enabled him to drop out of college and become the research and development director or something like that under the tutelage of Matt Lander or Mark Lander, excuse me, and Francis Collins. And this is Kevin McKernan, who I think is one of the smarter people behind the fake anti-vax movement that is best personified or exemplified by the organizations ICANN and Children's Health Defense. And at the start of the pandemic, I think the intention was to have ICANN and Children's Health Defense be the primary organizations that would play the role of Epigirl and, you know, a limited spectrum of debate about the skepticism to the COVID vaccine. And instead, things went wildly out of control. And as a result, they were never able to recruit an actor that would be naive enough to play the role that they, in the end, put this guy on the Danny Jones podcast. Now, remember that Danny Jones is actually a guy who admitted why he went into podcasting on the Joe Rogan show like 6 months ago. And that admission included being a down-the-street neighbor of Hulk Hogan, who we know was a beneficiary of a lawsuit against a internet news source called Gawker that had outed Peter Thiel as the gay space vampire that he is. And because they outed him as a alien lycanthrope who's also a homosexual, he decided to burn that internet platform by suing on behalf of Hulk Hogan, or paying for Hulk Hogan's lawyers, because Hulk Hogan had previously had a video of some kind exposed by Gawker. And so whereas the space vampire homosexual Peter Thiel had no claim against Gawker because he was indeed a homosexual space vampire, the release of this sex tape of Hulk Hogan gave him a valid claim against them. And so Peter Thiel paid his lawyers and he won a big lawsuit. And so Hulk Hogan was in debt to Peter Thiel, and may explain why he spoke, for example, at the Republican National Convention. But nevertheless, it's interesting to note that he went into podcasting, you know, and kind of told a story kind of about Hulk Hogan, and which kind of means that maybe he's part of this podcast network that's probably loosely organized around Austin and all the clowns in Austin that of course include a lot of the anti-vax movement. Old school, OG, old gangsters are in Austin, including Paulie Tommy and Andrew Wakefield, but also Joe Rogan is there. A lot of podcasts are there. Eric Weinstein is there. You know, this is where Elon Musk moved. I mean, it's all just kind of weird because it's all one show, and then it's not so weird. And so what he's going to do here is basically discredit everything that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is, and specifically discredit a book which was released around the time of the election called The Wuhan Cover-Up. And he discredits it on its face by claiming that somebody who was fired during the writing of the book actually helped with the writing of the book. And then specifically making two claims, sort of explanatory claims, that curiously enough are precisely 2 of 6 explanatory claims that I am quoted as delineating in the book of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Actually quoted, listed in the index as being ideas that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. got from this guy listed as an expert in the book. And instead, he goes on a podcast with a dude who didn't go into podcasting until Hulk Hogan and the space vampire Peter Thiel decided to recommend that he do that instead of advertising and making films for advertisements. This guy goes on there to completely contradict that book and therefore completely discredit the Health and Human Services Secretary's book that is put out on behalf of Children's Health Defense, supposedly the premier nonprofit in America that is I guess, somehow or another acting on behalf of children's health. America is being undermined by actors on the internet, and the absurdity of their script suggests to me that they never intended for any of these people to be on stage this long, and maybe this guy never at all. But instead, he found himself opposite Danny Jones. Again, a guy who can be directly, not using the Kevin Bacon game, but directly using Hulk Hogan to Peter Thiel connection to podcasting. You know, this network of fake people on fake scripts that are there to get you to ask the wrong questions and ponder very deeply the wrong answers. This guy who worked for the Human Genome Project is the best evidence that America as a whole has been undermined by a fake conservative movement, just in the same way that before the pandemic there was this fake anti-vax movement that was, for all practical purposes, undermining any reasonable inspection of the current vaccine schedule that existed in, let's say, 2015. Brian Hooker was already there. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was already there. Democracy Now! Was already there. Paul Offit was already there. Mary Holland was already there. Meryl Nass was already there. And those same actors are performing the same script now, 10 years later. And that's not by accident. It's because we were supposed to have gone all the way headlong into the trap during the pandemic, and there weren't supposed to be anybody outside of the trap anymore. So those few of us that are out here and that can see this and show it to other people can give evidence directly for there being a national security script behind Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Jay Bhattacharya, and therefore, that's all coffee, likely a national security script behind Donald Trump as well. This is a joke, and that would also explain the incredible incompetence of Harris and Biden. It's just all one national security theater. And they really needed somebody else besides this guy to do this, because it's just a disaster. This is forever. This video right here is all the evidence you will ever need.
How to create the coronavirus.
Taught who?
The Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Oh.
So there were grants that Fauci basically boomeranged off of EcoHealth into the WIV, because they put a gain of function ban on funding here in the States.
Right.
And
Obama did that, right?
Obama did that. And so what Fauci's creative way around that was, well, we'll fund a nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance, run by Peter Daszak, who will launder the money for us into the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Right. Therefore, it's not directly from Fauci to Wuhan. It's going through some intermediary. And through that process, they taught the Wuhan Institute of Virology how to do this seamless no-seum technique, which is a technique of assembling viral genomes so you don't leave any evidence behind. It's a ligation technique that uses a Golden Gate assembly. That it's a clever way of putting stuff together so that you can't tell that someone built it necessarily from a laboratory. However, they did leave behind some fingerprints that make us that got them caught, basically. And you should, if you want to hear about that story, you should get Charles Rixey on here. Charles Rixey has helped RFK write his book about this. And Charles Rixey's a Marine, and he's been like a dog on a bone with this problem. And he was the one who leaked the diffuse proposal. Are you familiar with the diffuse proposal?
No, what is that?
So there was a grant that was proposed to the DoD to go build a weaponized coronavirus under the banner of, we need to build a vaccine against this, because if we can do it, the Chinese can do it, kind of thing. And the DoD turned down the grant because they thought it's too fucking crazy. You'll have something that'll leak from this. But as anyone who's written grants, I've been involved in writing grants for our company. We got like $30 million in grants from the NIH. You don't apply with a grant not having done 80% of it. It's just you.
This is the first thing that I'm quoted in the book as saying, and again, it's one of the 6 actual quotes. I explain how, generally speaking, NIH grants are done. And so it's kind of comical that he says this, because it's not an NIH grant that we're talking about. We're talking about a DARPA grant, which is quite a bit different. And again, if they could have had me on the Danny Jones podcast saying this and claiming that RFK Jr.'s book is right, they wouldn't need to have him on the podcast opposite the the Hulk Hogan, Peter Thiel puppet. They wouldn't have to have him opposite Danny Jones. They would have me. But instead, they have him opposite Danny Jones in November of 2024, saying a fired Charles Rixey was actually the one who helped Robert F. Kennedy Jr. write his book, and then goes on to explain an exact sort of misquote as if it's his idea, when in fact it is the exact quote, one of only 6 that I am quoted of as explaining in the book. And the other one, which is coming up, is how restriction enzymes work. And my explanation in the book is, it's choice. And what he says is just plain dumb. It works, but it's weak. And so, again, what we're dealing with here is a scripted actor, someone desperately trying to keep the car on the road. But it's off the road, and it's been off the road for years already. It's wonderful, and it's also scary, because any newspaper in America, any news source in America could have figured this out by now, with my help or without my help, just watching my streams and checking my work. But no one's done it. No one has responded to my emails, my phone calls, my text messages. No one's seeing that this is the story right here. That the national security scripted actor, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and the absolute fraud, Jay Bhattacharya at the head of NIH, can be explained via Robert Malone and Kevin McKernan and a network of people behind a fake health freedom movement and a fake anti-vax movement that is just part and parcel for the same national security script that ran the pandemic in the first place. That's why this resistance is so seamlessly neutered, so seamlessly lacking progress, and is culminating with a former research and development director, supposedly, of the Human Genome Project, kind of sort of whistleblowing on a DNA contamination in the transfection that he for 6 years can't call a transfection, that he for 6 years has been bouncing from podcast to podcast to podcast to obfuscate the truth about. There's no way to explain 6 years of podcasting for this guy except by national security script. The same goes for Jill Glasspool Malone, the same goes for Meryl Nass, the same goes for Robert Malone, and the same goes for Stephen Hatfill. There's no way to explain the presence of Stephen Hatfill on podcasts, the presence of Stephen Hatfill in international COVID summits like in Romania, on stage with a lot of these other people, except because they are national security actors. And if we don't wake up to this, if the world doesn't wake up to this, then whatever plan is being orchestrated and puppeted by the puppet hand inside of America is going to be executed flawlessly over the next 5 years. However, if you can wake up and apologize to your kids and realize that the only way Donald Trump is at the helm is if it's by national security script that includes the controlled demolition of America, the destruction of American culture by Americans themselves, then I can't help you. Social media has trapped you. But here's your evidence right here. Kevin McKernan. There's nothing you can find on the internet that will support any other conclusion other than he is a scripted national security actor. And his specific interactions with me are just absolutely, they're just damning. He's a criminal, along with a lot of these other people.
You're looking for the last 20%, right? Because you just can't. You need the grant process is so grueling and so competitive that in order for you to succeed, you have to have all this preliminary data that shows like we can get X done. We've demonstrated this piece. We've demonstrated this piece. Now we just need to do this last piece. And in that diffuse proposal, they had used particular restriction enzymes. These are enzymes that cut at particular sequences in DNA.
Okay.
Those are important because they help guide the way that you cut and paste DNA together. So imagine if you're cutting and pasting a Word document But
now the absurdity is getting worse, right? Because as he talks about the diffuse proposal, it's important to realize that Charles Rixey supposedly is the guy who blew the whistle, but also Veritas, you know, the same guy that blew the whistle on Acorn, supposedly. Yes, that's correct. It's all the same script. It's all the same timeline. Actors put in place, stunts happening, then the stage is cleared, new scenery's put on, the same actors come out, they do the same shtick, and you don't see it. And in the pandemic, they just flooded the stage with actors. And they even put out side stages all over the place. So there were opening bands and side stages and performers over there and magicians over there. And so the whole thing has been set up to be one giant fire hose of nonsense. And if you get to the core of it anywhere, you're going to find one of these national security actors on a script. That's the design of social media, not the internet. The internet can be free, but social media cannot be free. It is by definition not free. And in fact, it's worse. It is a puppet show where they pretend that there's some algorithm over which they have no control that kind of decides how the content is distributed, when that's absolute nonsense. He's been seen by millions of people, if not tens of millions of people all around the world by design, because he is an American national security actor that has been in the employ of the Department of Energy since he was a young man. And so was his father. As an American, I am pleading to you, whoever can hear this, if whatever country you're in, whatever planet you're on, whatever starship, whatever galactic federation you serve, please come and help the Earth, because the Earth is under attack right now. We're under attack by some kind of nameless technocracy that has employed a lot of actors that have been connected to this mythology since the 50s. Because their parents were connected to this stuff since the 50s. It's crazy. Sam Harris's mom. Why didn't somebody else figure out Sam Harris's mom? Why did Housatonic Live? Why did Mark Kulak have to send me Sam Harris's mom's Wikipedia page?
Your highlighter to highlight what sentence you want to cut can only start and end with certain letters. Those are what restrictions enzymes are. So imagine you could only cut and paste where there's a the. So
Okay.
you would have to then build a paragraph knowing that the paragraphs that have sentences that start with the, we're going to cut with this enzyme. And the ones that have sentences that start with we have another enzyme with things that start with there, which is a couple more letters onto the, right? And we're going to use those enzymes to cut here. By doing that, we can assemble this genome. Well, they had certain restriction enzymes in that diffuse proposal that are present in coronavirus that's currently circulating. And that was kind of the smoking gun that showed that, okay, this was in fact assembled. It was a product of the diffuse proposal. Someone eventually carried out that grant application to its final conclusion. And that's what's actually circulating. And
Holy shit.
Rixey has the whole story on this. You want to talk to him and Alex Washburn. Alex Washburn did some really interesting work mapping out the frequencies of these cut sites in all other coronaviruses. And only in SARS-CoV-2 do they exist.
See, so that's really dumb. Why would Alex Washburn be the guy to do that? You can look at his academic record and you can see that he's not a virologist. And anyone who knows anything about working with DNA sequences using any one of the open source, little softwares, it's just working with text files. Anyone could do what Alex Washburn apparently was the only one who did it. He compared across coronaviruses and he found this signal where there's these, little segments, and it looks like they just put it together because that's how that Noam-Seum technique works, and you're just going to have to take my word for it. Wow, it's so amazing. Dang, man. And it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous because the one thing that means... The one thing that means is that they had a 100% reliable sequence upon which to analyze. Because if this was a real virus, whatever that is, whatever it could have purported to be before the pandemic. It would have been a non-specific signal where only the most conserved regions of the genome would be represented in high enough fidelity to be amplified and read. And so the idea that they have this sequence called SARS-CoV-2, and they can be, without a shadow of a doubt, certain about all these very specific sequences which correspond to very specific restriction enzyme, it's multiple bases, not necessarily overlapping, that the sequences can be specific for. So we're talking about some pretty crazy things. And then to top that all off, there's a video of Ralph Baric explaining the no-seum technique and explaining how it works. And it's not quite as simple as restriction enzymes and stuff like that. And that's unfortunate, right? That whole part of this is unfortunate, because if Ralph Baric is on the same national security script that Tony Fauci is, and that Peter Daszak of 60 Minutes fame is, don't forget that 60 Minutes just told us a whole hour about Jared Kushner being the hero of Gaza and Israel. Also told us that George Webb was a weirdo in February of 2020. Also told us that Peter Daszak was a virologist. Also even told us about Nathan Wolfe being a virologist. And so don't be surprised if next year Kevin McKernan is on 60 Minutes and we're told that he's a geneticist who works on marijuana but found DNA contamination in the transfection that we won't call transfection. We'll call it a life-saving coronavirus vaccine, and he will too. Don't be surprised.
In a manner where they are almost perfectly spaced into, they build the thing back together in 6 pieces. So the Humpty Dumpty comes back together in a sort of an engineering way through only in SARS-CoV-2. If you look at where those restriction sites exist in all the other coronaviruses we know about, they're kind of randomly scattered. They don't look like someone designed them in. When you look at them in SARS-CoV-2, they're very perfectly spaced such that an engineer put it together. And there's a particular set of them near the furin cleavage site that looks like it's designed to take that furin cleavage site in and out and mutate it and swap it around so that you can optimize this to actually hit ACE2 receptors. And what's remarkable about the zoonosis thesis is that this thing came out pre-optimized. Like when we first found SARS coronavirus, the binding affinity to ACE2 was already optimized. That's not normal. Like if this were a zoonotic event, the leap would mean it was unoptimized and would take maybe 5 or 10 years to become more optimized in the population. That's another signature that someone had to have a piece inside the design of this virus that they could swap in and out to put a library in there to combinatorially screen for furin cleavage sites and receptor binding domains that would effectively allow them to enrich for optimization out of the gate. And so Charles and Alex have a good story around this about how they use serial passaging and the engineering design that they have in this implicate this as being, in fact, a weapon that was built. And it's not something that hopped over from pangolins and bats and all that stuff.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Harvey Rich, I think, has another interesting window on this. Like it's worth the.
That's also an admission because Harvey Reich was on stage with Stephen Hatfield and Robert Malone and Brett Weinstein and Jessica Rose and Meryl Nass in Romania in November of 2023, right before many of those same people, minus Stephen Hatfield, were in front of the Senate with Senator Ron Johnson in January of 2024. It's all one malevolent show, and it's being orchestrated by this guy and Robert Malone, as best as I can tell. Their connections make sense, their affiliations make sense, their history makes sense, and more importantly, their 5-year recent history makes complete sense. They are scripted actors, they are behind CHD and ICANN, they are behind RFK Jr. and the fake health freedom movement, the fake anti-vax movement. They're probably in cahoots with the same people that script, Paul Offit. It's all the same. They probably have steak dinners together, or at least did 10 years ago before this all started.
view on the Ron Johnson thing that I was at. Harvey gave his pitch on like, all right, where the hell did this all come from, and how do we avoid doing this again?
Right.
And he had the most compelling synopsis, I think, because everyone's been like, can they be this evil? What the hell happened? And I think his story makes the most sense, which is that the biodefense, industry, if you will, has always kind of justified itself on that we need to be doing gain of function research to protect against a particular weapon. And so we're going to preemptively do all this. Here, fast forward to 2020, they've never come up with something they've saved us from. And then the first thing that leaks is potentially from their own making, right?
Right.
So that puts the biodefense industry on their heels, in that we have to be in control of the solution to this. Otherwise, we're non-existent when this is done. So let's get Fauci involved, because they had him on payroll. And of course, Fauci, I think you've probably seen some of those emails and conversations that have come out where it's like,
God.
You'll have orders, you have
Or
things to do.
He's so arrogantly talking about you'll get a vaccine or you'll lose your job.
Yes,
the kids will get kicked out of school.
His emails internally that leaked out of the NIH were like, you'll have things to do tomorrow. You must read this paper. This is a paper about, potential leak, right? Early on, this is like February and the pandemic, where it first hit on him that this could have come from money from his pocket. Like, it could have come from the WIV, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so suddenly Tony's now implicated in maybe have funding the virus that leaked. And suddenly he's in panic mode, sending emails to everyone that night, like, read all this stuff. You'll have assignments tomorrow. Like, we got to get on this. And Francis Collins is in there talking about how we have to have a swift takedown of all these conspiracy theories that say it could be engineered. And so they're in high gear right now trying to cover this up. But his take is that the biodefense program then went into high gear trying to get seen as the only solution to fix this. That way they would have a justification for, yes, something leaked. Sorry, we don't really know who made it, but we happen to save the day with our biodefense program having this vaccine ready. See, this gain of function stuff really needs to happen. Otherwise, millions of people would have died without this, which is a narrative you hear people try to propagate in the news, right? That without this vaccine, it saved 20 million people. They conjure up all of these weird epidemiological studies that try to make that case, and they're all modeling studies that are easily dismantled.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that is a lesson for us going forward, that this gain of function work is more dangerous than it can ever help. And it is something they need to put a real tight lid on, because I'm involved on a separate side of this, which is, okay, you found a contaminant in these vaccines, that could implicate fraud. Fraud might unwind the PrEP Act. Therefore, lawyers can now go after the FDA. And the first trial that tried to do that was with Brooke Jackson. And Brooke Jackson had evidence of the trials being fabricated. Like, she was at Ventavia being asked to shift around the PCR numbers or shift around the data on unblind this site and blind that site. That way they could play games with the clinical trial data.
Right.
And she blew the whistle on that. They brought that to court. The judge ruled that this was not, yes, Pfizer lied, but they were told to lie by the DoD. This is not a typical manufacturing arrangement. This is actually a biological countermeasure. The DoD is running this. You have the wrong defendant. So they have to re-steer their case maybe.
And so now we have this. This is all the same interview in November of 2024. Now remember, right now, currently, the former lawyer of Scott Shara, Grace's dad, that lawyer is now podcasting. And he's podcasting the same thing that Sasha Latipova and Catherine Watt have been saying for a long time, that this is a DOD operation. It's a kill box. It was a bioweapon. The whole thing is the DOD. So that's the reason why Pfizer's not guilty, even though no one ever says BioNTech. BioNTech is the company that made it. Like it or not, Pfizer put its name on it, but Pfizer didn't manufacture it. BioNTech manufactured it. It's BioNTech's, that German company's technology. And so all of this is very strange. Sasha Latipova being in this is very strange, because her daughter was on social media before the pandemic, and not in a good way, not in a responsible way, not in a, wow, you're a great mom sort of way. And so for her to be behind this and part of Team Robert Malone, on stage with him in multiple countries, she being a part of the same show that Kevin McKernan is a part of. Realize this. It's all one malevolent show. And Kevin McKernan of the Human Genome Project means that it's not your family's fault. If your family fell for the voice and charm of Andrew Wakefield, I can be very disappointed. But if your family member fell for Kevin McKernan, you can't be disappointed or upset in them, because Kevin McKernan is a master class in what a real national security state actor on a script can do. You need to watch every podcast this guy has ever done that you have time for. You have to make sure you watch the one where he came on my show when I was still trying to catch up and figure out what was going on and still hadn't realized that RNA virology was one giant fraud. I still assumed the vast majority of people were telling the truth, including him, including Charles Rixey. And this is going on 5 years ago that this guy started meddling with my family, meddling with my business and my ability to make a living. He is a criminal from my perspective. If I had a lawyer out there, somebody that understood what was going on, we'd be taking money from this guy. I would own his house by now, because he is a fraud who has directly meddled with my reputation, my ability to make a living, and that up into and including going on Danny Jones's podcast and lying about the Health and Human Services Secretary's book and the consultation that led to its creation and completion. This is a malevolent national security actor, and he's your best window into the fraud that is the fake health freedom movement and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Meryl Nass and Mary Holland and Children's Health Defense and Brian Hooker.
Toward the DOD. I mean, they don't know. This is, how do you sue the DOD?
The judge said that they were told to lie about the SV40 because of
not SV40. This is just fraud, a different form of fraud.
Different form of fraud.
But we expect if we approach them with the SV40 thing, they'll probably use the same excuse. Like, it's a precedent that
I
they've
can't
set.
believe this SV40 story isn't everywhere.
So the SV40 story, of course, is Kevin McKernan on this show as a former director of the Human Genome, or former research and development director of the Human Genome Project, claiming that one of the things that's contaminated in the shot is a intact SV40 promoter, which is an incredibly common molecular sequence used in virtually every university in the Western world, because it's used in cell culture and in bacterial culture to drive the copying of DNA plasmids that you want to make lots of copies of. It's actually so ubiquitous, it's kind of absurd. Anybody that's been through a medical institute and walked through the walls or walked through the hallways has probably gotten it on their shoes. It's a sequence. It's everywhere. And so for him to claim that it's a sequence that was nowhere until it was in the transfections that were thrown out by Pfizer, that is a very, very bold claim. And because that very, very bold claim is compartmentalized and completely isolated on the internet, you can again see it as an incredible piece of evidence that the internet is being used against us, or this guy with all of his credentials would be able to call someone and say, hey, this is Kevin McKernan. You remember me? We got a big problem and we got to tell people about it. And it's not happening. Instead, he's going on podcasts and telling people, and then the rest of the time he's spending his life doing conferences about marijuana.
Yeah, it's they have a lot of fact checkers talking about it, which is a sign that they're worried about it. Like they don't assign all the fact checkers you see. If you dig into them, there's some connection of money either back to the Gates Foundation or to a pharmaceutical company one way or another. Like they are pumping out. I mean, even the government came out saying they had $1 billion to spend on reducing vaccine hesitancy for basically, marketing their narrative, if you will. So when you can tell which topics worry them by how many fact checkers are sick on it. And we're probably right up there at the top. If you look up the SV40 stuff, they have gotten every one of the fact checkers to write something.
And so again, I will stress that it is very important to see that all of the actors that have been put in front of us, including Mary Talley Bowden and Ryan Cole, soon to be candidate for the governor of Idaho, have exclusively agreed to participate in this spectacular commitment to lies, which at the heart of it is a consensus that PCR can be used as a diagnostic. Because even though there was this pretend resistance to PCR as a diagnostic during the first couple years of COVID, we came out of COVID with PCR as an accepted diagnostic that the FDA is no longer concerned in regulating. And we have diagnostics that are being used all around the United States and all around the world that are supposedly capable of diagnosing up to 20 different viral pathogens using PCR alone. And this is not real. This is a spectacular commitment to lies, and they are regularly made to confirm their commitment to that lie. Here is Ryan Cole testifying under oath in the United States government, in the Senate or somewhere, about who he is, and he states very specifically that he's done hundreds of thousands of COVID tests. We have been manipulated by these actors on social media, and many of them were recruited in 2020 by Robert Malone and Kevin McKernan. I'm certain of it. That's what Robert Malone meant when he spun his team up.
I'm Dr. Ryan Cole. I'm an MD. I'm a physician. Mayo Clinic trained anatomic clinical pathology, subspecialty fellowship in dermatopathology. I do molecular biology. I've done over 150,000 COVID tests in my laboratory.
That's an admission. It's an admission that all of these people are part of the same show. It's one malevolent technocracy show that is trying to take permanent control of the evolution of the species. And they've known since Joshua Lederberg, the only way to do that would be to put you guys aside and take control. Not everybody is smart enough to be a part of this ruling elite. And so they've been having auditions for the last few months, and these auditions have led to this group of people being behind Robert F. Kennedy Jr. They're all on a script. They all trust it, but they are all vulnerable because they're not all supposed to still be there. This was supposed to be a couple years, and then that was it. But we're still here, and that's really bad for them. I really believe wholeheartedly that that's bad for them. I think this time it could be different. I do. I think this time it could be different. We can take the power back from these people. Let me make myself a little smaller there. That's my message of hope. It's not a message for everyone, but it is a message for anyone. We are right here, right now. We choose where we go forward. We choose if we're ever on social media again, if we ever listen to any of these people or engage in their theater. And I would suggest to you that the way out is biology. We can change this. All we got to do is stop participating. We got to get off of social media because the illusion requires your participation to sustain. Ladies and gentlemen, intramuscular injection is dumb. Transfection in healthy people is nuts. RNA cannot pandemic. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, biological men can only ever be trans men. Once you see the truth, that the U.S. vaccine schedule is just plain ridiculous when compared to any other vaccine schedule on Earth. You can see it as a criminal enterprise. It's just a question of why. The real question is why, and none of these people really have a succinct answer for it. That's the way you can see they're full of baloney. This is Gigaohm Biological, a high-resistance, low-noise information brief. It's the 21st of October, 2025. It is a message of hope that is for anyone, but not for everyone, because this is for all the marbles. It's for the children, the grandchildren of Earth. Ladies and gentlemen, the murder and lies hiding behind this is pure oxygen causes ARDS. PCR is not a useful diagnostic tool. and not using antibiotics for pneumonia is a crime. You could explain that to your kids, and then you can also explain why in the world would they do this. They understand that there's only one chance in history to collect this diversity of genetic and medical data available on Earth. There will never be more experimental animals again, and so you got to collect the data now. Even if the AI isn't ready, even if the machine learning algorithms are still in their baby stages, we got to collect the data now, because the data is only available now. There's only a couple generations before 10 billion becomes 500 million, and all that data is lost. The opportunity is lost. And so these actors were put in place to curate a narrative to make sure any damage from transfection could be blamed effectively on the novel virus. And that was all part of the Human Genome Project. That's really how to explain this. They need all the data. They need to store it. They're not building all this data infrastructure to store videos for Netflix. They're doing it to store the medical data, store the data. It's all building an infrastructure that will eventually be turned on your children. And it needs to be accessible to the machine learning algorithm. They need to validate this over several times. And so the Human Genome Project is actually where we are. That's at the center of this. That's what the murder and lies for what are all about. That's the question that everybody doesn't seem to have an answer for. It's Israel and the Jews are doing it, or something like that. The bankers. No, it's got to have a bigger ideal than that. It's got to have a bigger idea. It ain't Satan. It ain't because Satan told people to do it. It's not. There is a very specific reason why we are being governed in this way, and it's for the data.
Moment to defeat cancer. So today is about you, the fighters and the survivors, the caretakers and the researchers, the philanthropists and the patient advocates. It's about the millions of Americans, their loved ones, and all those.
So now remember, this is when he's a vice president. This is 2016. This is right at the end of the presidency, right? Because guess, right? What's going on here? This might be January or something like that. But the point is to see that this is one continuous narrative. Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump. It's one continuous national security thing. Maybe even Obama was just a puppet, a dude they put there. And everybody cheered because finally we have a black president, and they all laughed. I mean, at this stage, we need to wake up and apologize to our children for having been asleep at the wheel for so long, believing that Pelosi and all of these other people had our best interests in mind, and so we could just go on with our daily lives. Completely wrong. Completely wrong. Let's listen to Jill and listen to I guess that's Joe Biden, but I don't know, there could be several, whatever.
Around the world who are confronting cancer. It's about hope, but ultimately it's about action. Because of all of you and many others watching at home, we've made incredible progress this year. Progress that Joe will talk about in detail. So now it's my pleasure to introduce a man of action, the man President Obama put in control, at mission control of this moonshot, my husband, our Vice President, Joe Biden.
Gina McCarthy, the EPA, Dr. Francis Collins, NIH director, and the guy who is most responsible for the Human Genome Project, an incredible achievement all by itself. The National Cancer Institute director, Doug Lowy, who has been a great ally and educator of mine. FDA administrator, Robert Califf, and acting administrator for Medicare and Medicaid services, Andy Slavitt. And
we have a former colonel in the Turkish army at the head of CMS right now, but he mentions Andy Slavitt. Andy Slavitt's got a great book from 2021 called Preventable, if you want a good laugh at the fireplace, easy read because it's like at the 6th grade level. This book is phenomenally shitty. Anyway, Andy Slavitt, great nod to one of these people who, pretends to have expertise in public health and stuff like that, but they're really just scripted actors of the worst kind, the national security kind.
Tyler Jacks, Elizabeth Jaffe, and the co-chairs of the Blue Ribbon Commission. I wish I could, and the public deserves to know every one of you in this room. And I mean every one of you, because you're the ones that have done such remarkable work to date, and you're the ones who are going to be responsible for what I believe will be an enormous amount of progress we'll make soon. First of all, when Barack Obama asked me to head up this moonshot, there were some skeptics out there and said, well, here we go again. Nixon declared a war on cancer in 1971. There's a big difference. In 1971, President Nixon's interest and concern was real and genuine, but he had no army. He had no resources. No clear strategy existed to win. But 45 years later, after decades and decades of funding, new research, training scientists and physicians, treating millions of patients because of so many of you, we now have a powerful new technologies and tools. We have an army. And with this moonshot, a clear strategy on the road ahead. The moonshot does two things. One, first, it injects, and because of all of you, an incredible sense of urgency back into this fight. Part of it is that what I said to the president when I walked out in the Rose Garden that day and said, I regret, it was spontaneous. I said, the only thing I regret is not announcing I'm not running for president. I'd like to preside over the end of cancer as we know it. Not we'd solve it all, but the end of cancer as we know it. And some wags, particularly in some of your professions, said, here we go again. Here we go again. But you know what? What happened is that because of you, there is a fundamental new sense of urgency. I think you all can feel it. You've generated it. It's not only here, but it's around the world. And the second thing is, back in 1971, when there was no army, there was not all this data. We didn't even know then there were 200 different cancers. What's happened is that we had a set of rules, a culture that was established for research and cooperation that is not applicable to 2016. The change in the cultural system that's needed to win this fight is kind of what we're all about. Jill and I, as Jill mentioned,
a cultural change is needed to win the battle. I wonder what cultural change is needed.
Every family is facing, everybody knows someone, if not their own family, facing cancer. And we know what it does to a family. Our family learned as much as we could, which all of you do, and some of you who are in the profession are survivors and or you've lost someone. And what do you do even if you have no background in cancer? It's your child, your husband, your wife. You try to learn everything you can.
Trying to learn everything you can sounds like doing your own research. Be careful, Joe.
Everything you can about the disease, both for purposes of hope and deciding on what you can do. What is it you can do? Is there anything you can do that speeds the progress? Because the one thing that every single cancer patient needs is a little bit of hope. Hope. My mother used to say, where there's life, there's hope. What we learn from the world's best nurses, physicians, and researchers is that even if we couldn't save our son, the science, the medicine, the technology are progressing faster than ever. So we'll be able to save countless sons and daughters. As I've been saying repeatedly, I didn't realize this till Bo was diagnosed with stage 4 glioblastoma. We knew it was the death sentence. We're not slow. He knew. We all knew. But there was hope. We just thought there was hope because cancer in the last 6 years reached an inflection point that didn't exist 7, 8, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. By inflection point, and we found there's a recognition that the cancer system established 5 decades ago needs to be re-imaged for the 21st century. That too often our cancer culture and system still plays by the rules of 71, not 2016. But so much has changed. Let me explain. 5 years ago, oncologists weren't routinely working with immunologists. Immunology was sort of a voodoo science 10, 15 years ago. No, I'm not joking. I'm a bit pejorative, but truly, engaging the immune system to kill cancers. There were 3 things that were done routinely: find the tumor, excise it, what you couldn't get out, make sure you radiate the margins, and number 3, which kills a lot of healthy parts of your brain or your body, and then engage in significant doses, depending on the seriousness of the cancer, of chemotherapy, which kills an awful lot of those cells that we need to engage, those T cells, to kill the cancer. So with immunologists and virologists, geneticists, chemical engineers, and others, they're now all working together and beginning to work even more closely together. It's becoming more routine than the exception now. Today, there's a recognition that by aggregating and sharing data from millions of patients, genomics, family histories, lifestyles, treatment outcomes, we have now what we didn't have before. We have a supercomputing capacity. We can actually do a million, you all know it, but the press, 1 million billion calculations per second, enabling us, at least theoretically, if we aggregate enough data, to be able to find new patterns and causes and successful treatments of cancer. Why does one treatment work on you and not on me? We have the same cancer.
Why does the same vaccine hurt you and not me? Why did your kid get autism? Why did Peter Hotez's kid get autism and not mine? He says it's a genetic thing. Can you see it yet? This is 2016, 3 years after Joe Rogan did his Deadly Viruses program on Sci-Fi. That would be also 2013, the year that Brian Hooker went on a radio program and said he doesn't use the word autism. He doesn't like the word autism. His son was vaccine damaged. 2016 in April was the year that ICANN was founded and the movie Vaxxed was released in America, and the year that Robert De Niro went on Good Morning America twice in a week in order to say something about the movie Vaxxed. In the same year that Donald Trump was elected president, despite their best efforts, despite Hillary Clinton's best effort in the debate, Donald Trump won. That's what we're supposed to believe.
Because of technological advances and analyzing cancer genes and other genes in the body.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Human Genome Project. They want you to think it's pharmaceutical companies or the DOD told the pharmaceutical companies to lie about it. No. Stop lying! No. It's the Human Genome Project. They want you to believe it's social media censoring people and it's not fair because the government asked them to censor people and that's all they did. No. They amplified actors and they de-amplify real patriots and put other people in their place. And so like they did with the anti-vax movement before the pandemic, they have created a fake conservative movement in America that they can manipulate, fragment, and destroy in exactly the same way that they have basically done with any meaningful anti-vax movement. They kill a few people and then they fragment it and destroy it with bullshit narratives that never progress and actors that agree to stay on that non-progressing script. It's very malevolent because the social media landscape is not free. It is a military landscape with military actors that are distributed with military precision. and the fake conservative movement in America is now in full swing, and it was first in a microcosm visible in the anti-vax movement before the pandemic. And that's why I think all of these organizations are just a natural expansion of that. Herding cats. It's not very easy, so you need lots of shepherds. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really ugly, but that's the reason why that genomics expert, Claire Craig, is at the head of HART in the UK, and that's why she's promoted by all the people in Panda from South Africa. That's the reason why this guy says that he spun a team up and used AI and X-ray crystallography computer models of all the pharmaceuticals on the FDA register to scan for ivermectin and remdesivir. That's why this lady was on a call with him in 2011 about the anthrax vaccine. That's why that person there claims to have 5 post-secondary degrees, which isn't even really a thing. That's why that fake Belgian guy over there who worked with this guy at Solvay is now talking about the ever-evolution of the virus and how eventually the vaccine people are really going to get sick because SARS-CoV-2 is going to come back and get them. And that's the reason why the glyphosate expert from MIT has been involved with trying to say that autism is caused by glyphosate since 2017. Yes, that person, Stephanie Seneff down there. It's all one show. Whew, it's crazy. But it's all one show. That's why in January of 2020 it is Lee Min Yan and Stephen Hatfill on Steve Bannon's broadcast. Steve Bannon calls Tony Lyons a genius. Tony Lyons is the guy behind Skyhorse Publishing that wrote the book with Jesse Ventura, where the epilogue told a story about a Republican candidate taking an independent candidate named Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as their vice president and then getting shot after the election. In 2008, that book is from. This book. It's all one malevolent show, and social media makes it really hard to see that these people have been at it since the early 2000s, if not long before. That's the only way to explain the odd professional connection between Les Weinstein and Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s dad, Robert F. Kennedy. It's the only way to explain the odd connection between Les Weinstein and Estes Kefauver. The only way to explain the odd connection between Les Weinstein and thalidomide. The only way to explain the odd connection between Eric Weinstein and Peter Thiel. The only way to explain the odd connection between Danny Jones and Peter Thiel and Kevin McKernan and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Merrill Ness and Robert Malone and all of them. It can't be any other way.
While Bobby is focused on ending the corporate capture of our regulatory agencies, I am going to assemble the best technologists and scientists in the world, and we will use the latest in AI and computation and examine the health records databases of our nation and those other nations who are also on a quest to solve chronic disease.
That can't be by accident, ladies and gentlemen. It simply cannot be by accident. Nobody and nothing is in this narrative by chance. And once you understand that, then you understand that everybody has a timeline. And my timeline is just an unblemished record of integrity where groups of people have meddled with my ability to make a living and care for my family for almost 6 years straight. And those people include the highest level of all this cast. This international traveling group of performers that includes all the way up to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Robert Malone and Merrill Nass and Jay Bhattacharya, Steve Kirsch, all of them. It's simply unexplainable. There's where that thing that she was talking about in the beginning. Go back to 2013 and see. This is him right here on my website. Thank you. This is Brian Hooker. Talking on a radio network thing, saying that he doesn't think that his son was, it's not right, ladies and gentlemen. He doesn't say the word autism. He says vaccine injury. He questions the entire idea of vaccination. And that can't be by accident. Just in the same way it can't be by accident. Nobody knows who Brandy Vaughn is. that all these people stood in front of Brandy Vaughn, that Brandy Vaughn thought all these people were fake, that Brandy Vaughn didn't like any of these people, and then she got dead in 2020, and everybody forgot about her. But she was putting up billboards across from Paul Offit's hospital. That's a lot more than CHD has ever done. But then again, nobody's in this narrative by chance. Of course, don't forget, April 2016, we have, of course, the vaxxed, and these people are all together. There's James Lyons Weiler. There's Judy Mikovits of CFS and AIDS fame. There's Del Bigtree, and there's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. These people are all scripted frauds, and some are unwitting participants, but in the end, Brandy Vaughn was dead in 2020. Tony Bark was dead in 2020, and these people are still in front of us now.
Oh my gosh, it was so great, so great. So my first.
And so if we listen to Brian Hooker in December of 2020,
clinical trial data was hastily put together over a period of 10 to 14 weeks.
We're going to hear Brian Hooker talk about the safety studies being too short, vaccines causing sickness, 5G warfare, neutralizing antibodies and what they do. We're going to talk about asymptomatic carriers. We're going to talk about vaccines that target T cells don't exist right now. And we're not going to question PCR at all. In December of 2020, just a month or two, or maybe a week or two after Brandy Vaughn, somebody that he considered a hero, was died or killed or dead, just before the largest wave of murder that would occur in America in the winter of 2020 into 2021. Brian Hooker is a scripted fraud because remember, in 2013, he didn't use the word autism. He didn't like the word autism. His son was vaccine damaged. And now, in 2020, he's part of an organization that says vaccines cause autism. His personal story is that his son had an ear infection, and that's why 5 vaccines in one day caused autism in his son. But it doesn't have to be in everybody's son. And I don't know if he remembers whether he gave him Tylenol or not. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrible where we are. Because I used to think Brian Hooker was a good guy too, but there's no way to explain his oration in that thing as a happy little accident. There's no way to explain the track record of Jessica Rose as a happy little accident, nor is there any way to explain any of these other people's track record as a happy little accident. It's all scripted. Electronic health records are now being regularly mined. They just need to be de-identified first. And this is already ongoing, just like they did with Chess and Go. The real thing for the slavers was this. That's why they needed a worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario accomplished something that most people aren't even aware of, that PCR is used as a diagnostic in all places on Earth now. And that creates a remnant stream of sequencing data. Every time they swab your kid, every time they swab you, every time they take a swab to see what is somebody has when they come into the ER, they are inevitably generating a medical remnant. Just the same way that circumcising a newborn baby, male baby in an American hospital generates a medical remnant that people will pay a lot of money for, just like abortions generate a medical remnant that a lot of people will pay money for, just like a C-section generates a medical remnant that a lot of people will pay a lot of money for. Do you understand the worst case scenario is that the United States population is already effectively nothing more than experimental animals? The vaccine schedule in the USA has been successfully insulated from any public scrutiny because they put clowns in front of us. They made us follow clowns. They made us ignore some of the clowns, but follow other of the clowns, and fragmented us into a useless resistance by military precision. Please see it for what it is. The vaccine schedule will continue to expand younger and older, eventually to be replaced with transfection. That's genetic material, because that's the gold standard, right? And it's a personalized thing potentially, whereas, the genetic vulnerabilities that everybody agrees underlie at least some of autism. ladies and gentlemen, that's all accomplished for the slavers by the same group of people because they're all on the same script. There's no epidemiological evidence of spread. There is a lot of evidence of murder. And there is an anticipated rise in all-cause mortality that all these life insurance companies, actuaries knew about. All these people knew about. That's why they scripted the national security exercise to occur when the peak was expected. That's why they knew when to put people on the internet. That's why they knew when to put people in place. That's how they knew when this would happen, because they've known it was coming since I was a senior in high school. And so try to find another one of these clowns that has put together a succinct list. You know, a succinct list that the Health and Human Services Secretary could have had on a chart had any one of the hearings that he's been involved in were hours and hours of questioning. He could have just started with this. That first we need to take into account the million Americans that were killed by opioids. First we need to take into account the fact that critical care medicine teaches that supplementary oxygen can be dangerous and leads directly to ARDS, you know, that condition that's also tied to a coronavirus infection and a coronavirus name, but actually originates from ICU treatment using pure oxygen. Yes, that's right. SARS-CoV-2 and SARS, the original virus, cause ARDS is actually a national security narrative because ARDS is a condition that's caused by pure oxygen, overventilation, you know, to stop spread, lack of antibiotic use because, as, you know, Griffin and all these other people like Rack and Yellow say, there's a viral pneumonia.
Stop lying!
Now, of course, there's death certificate fraud and financial incentives and all this other stuff, but a focus on that stuff when the totality of the numbers can be explained by the population pyramid plus opioids plus lack of antibiotic use plus supplementary oxygen, and none of those three are ever said. You can see how easy it is. You can see how easy it is. They have just put people in front of us who just happen to not be able to get the bulk of the equation right, but all the other details they're really focused on. But Jessica Rose is sure that opioids haven't done anything to decrease life expectancy in America. This team of performers with elaborate costumes and effects, all on the same script. Here's a video coming up that gets my channel roughly, gets me blocked right away because apparently this little video here is somehow copyrighted. Anyway, this is what it looks like. This is a guy pretending to stop and start a train, and I just want you to imagine if there were hundreds of that guy with fancy costumes on and a bunch of sound effects and maybe some fireworks. It would be hard for you to dismiss that these people were actually involved in stopping and starting the train, especially if they grunted and screamed and yelled, and maybe even somebody got hurt while they were doing it and they needed you to replace them. It would almost be impossible to resist that level of an illusion of consensus, and that's what they can do on social media, and that's why they did it, and they do it with Israel and Gaza and Libya and the EU and Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, and they do it by putting these people on podcasts, putting these people on social media, putting these people on stage, and making it pretend like something real is happening. And it's not real things happening. These are real actors acting. That's why these three people were in Sweden and on stage with Robert Malone and Meryl Nass and Jessica Rose. That's why the mother of Soph is behind Robert F. Kennedy Jr. That's why this fraud is behind Maha. That's why that Canadian up there, Michael Palmer, lost my presentation to Doctors for COVID Ethics and didn't put it on their website, just the same way as Nick Hudson did with my 3 presentations to Panda in 2022. Because they are all part of the same orchestrated theater around the world, loosely organized around, I don't know, NATO countries or UK countries, countries that are still loyal to the crown. It's really interesting. It's really, really interesting to me to try and ponder how it is that they assembled these scripted frauds. But there is no question that these people are especially scripted frauds. Michael Palmer has a book with CHD. Asim Malhotra is like a rock star in his little world of touring stages. And Sasha Latipova has a daughter that threatened to kill the YouTube CEO, had 1 million subscribers on YouTube before the pandemic, and got on Alex Jones 3 times in 2019. And now she's supposed to be some kind of whistleblower on the DOD, retired pharma executive who sold her company to Pfizer, a Ukrainian behind Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and CHD. I mean, imagine how ridiculous it is to believe that any of these people are real. Imagine that Sasha Latipova is not in jail. Imagine that Asim Malhotra is respected in any forum that he shows up at. Imagine that Michael Palmer can even walk the street without getting hit by rotten vegetables. But it's true. We live in a world right now where the vast majority of people that engage in social media think those people are some kind of whistleblowers on their own money, on their own time, traveling the world trying to save people. They are a team of performers in elaborate costumes and effects. It's easy to see.
On October 13th.
Remember, Paul Offit was first presented to us on Democracy Now! Opposite Mary Holland in April of 2015. Actually, before the Vax movie came out by a whole year, these people were already put in place with an argument about MMR and MMR causing her autism and him saying that that's impossible, when MMR is one of the only subcutaneous vaccines and one of the more likely not to be responsible for the total toxicity that is the U.S. vaccine schedule because of its subcutaneous administration, if it's administered correctly. And so that's all part of the narrative that, of course, the absolute fraud, Andrew Wakefield, and the absolute fraud, Polly Tommy, were on billboards in the UK, 90 billboards in the UK, swaying 6 million votes with autism awareness back in the 2000s. It's all one malevolent show, and Paul Offit has agreed to be a part of it. That's why the argument that he makes in 2025 is identical to the argument he was making in 2015, 10 years ago. Let's listen.
It's 2025. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and joining me today is your host, Dr. Paul Offit.
Hi, Vincent.
This is the video version of Paul's column on Substack called Beyond the Noise, cutting to the chase on important health topics. I don't know, Paul, when you started this column, did you have any idea that we would end up where we are today?
No, I don't think anybody did. This is as worse than anybody would have ever imagined about how we have just shredded our public health infrastructure.
Okay, so I would argue that this is all the same script, and actually we expected to be here. We just wanted to be here like in a different form. We wanted to be here with well, we're all right. I mean, we have a pretty small skeptic group that's also skeptic of their leader, right? The skeptical health freedom movement is still skeptical of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. because he hasn't done what he said he was going to do. And so we're actually maybe right where we're supposed to be, but maybe there's more people that are skeptical than they wanted to be. They wanted this to be a smaller movement than it is, but don't get me wrong. I'm not implying that it's half and half, because it's not. But it is still a larger minority than they wanted it to be. And so these people are working harder and longer on stage than they ever thought they would need to. And so I think it's an interesting place that we are right now, because the orchestrated failure of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is going to be harder than they thought because people are so skeptical of him. It's going to be harder than just burning Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and making him look like a fool, and then now everybody else is just going to have to eat crow when they've already kind of rejected him. And a lot of people have already rejected the health freedom movement. It's actually pretty spectacular. The only place that the health freedom movement actually exists is on these podcasts. And because Paul Offit and Vincent Racaniello and all of the people under Steve Bannon's banner say it exists. Otherwise, it doesn't exist anywhere. There's no health freedom movement in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, just every week something new, the destruction of the CDC, the destruction of public health, destruction of NIH and FDA. I never envisioned that any of that would happen. You know, I didn't think it could.
Neither did I. You assumed that there were checks and balances that wouldn't allow it to happen, but we were wrong.
Well, today we're going to continue with the destruction of...
I mean, if you really want to understand it, the destruction of public health in America, you have to see that Vincent Racaniello and Paul Offit and Mary Holland and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. are all part of the same team that these 6 people are. The same team that Denny Rancor is on, because Denny Rancor was on stage in Romania with Steve Hatfield and Robert Malone and Meryl Nass and Jessica Rose. And the No Virus people, because they've been promoted by CHD and all of them as well. It's all one show. America is the primary victim, but America is being used to manipulate the rest of the Western world via social media. And Americans are being manipulated by actors in those respective places on social media in America. And if you see that they are all on the same script, you can see that the way out is to get off of social media where their performance takes place.
United States Public Health. We're going to take a look at Paul's latest column called Vaccines Don't Save Lives. Oh my gosh. So let's start with a hearing where Senator Maria Cantwell presented some information about vaccines. That was a finance committee hearing. What did she say?
So she put up a chart that showed how vaccines have saved our lives, millions of lives, allowed us to live decades longer than we did before. And she went through sort of vaccine by vaccine by vaccine to show you how many lives were saved.
The history on vaccines is very clear. This is the 20th century. That's how many people had vaccines and had illnesses. This is the 21st century. This is the decrease, 99% down to 100%. This is what was delivered with vaccines.
And I presume these charts were based on real data from CDC, right?
I wonder what other things it would correlate with, like automobile abundance, cell phone abundance, or number of phone numbers in America, or area codes in America, or number of websites. I bet you there's 10,000 things that you could have put on that chart and said it correlates with vaccines, including sanitation, including nutrition, including lots of other things too. And so how will they counter that, right? Because, of course, on our side, there's been lots of videos of people. There are whole books written by Skyhorse Publishing authors that say that unvaxxed kids are better than vaxxed kids at everything. And so what's the big deal? Like, what are they? How are they going to counter this?
That's right. When we still had a CDC. Yes.
Yes. So I assume millions of lives had been saved on those charts, right?
That's right.
And what was RFK Jr.'s response to this presentation?
Well, that presentation was largely for his benefit because he has consistently expressed anti-vaccine points of view. She wanted to state the obvious, which is that vaccines are important. You wouldn't think you would have to say that to somebody who's now Secretary of Health and Human Services, but she did. His response was to make a 7-minute video on X that basically contradicted what she said. So he showed predominantly.
So here he is also agreeing that a video on X is a significant statement, a public communication, a relevant thing to discuss. And so a valid way for a public servant to communicate with the voting public. And that's kind of terrifying because, as I will succinctly say here, PBS NewsHour also agrees that Substacks are interesting, that Substacks can be worth $150 million. If you're a Jewish lesbian and have a right-wing Substack, you might get lucky. And so he has a Substack and agrees that Substack is a great way to make money and get a thing out. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s organizations have Substacks, so that sucks. And they can get on X and say whatever they want to. And so if their misinformation is enticing enough, they can make lots of money, like millions of dollars for a whole decade. And there's nothing that anybody can do about it, including me. And so we're just supposed to watch the X video because he says it's an X video we should watch. It's almost as if it's one national security narrative to get everybody to accept social media as the norm, you know, like a trap.
Only two graphs. He showed a graph of measles in this country over the past, say, 100 years. And he showed a graph of whooping cough or pertussis over the past 100 years to make the point that the incidence of deaths was declining even before there was a vaccine.
Well, you can see from this graph that in 1900, some 13,000 Americans a year were dying of measles. By 1960, however, this number had dropped to a few hundred. But the measles vaccine was not introduced until 3 years later. Therefore, almost all the measles mortality had disappeared before the vaccine. So the measles vaccine can't really claim the credit for saving all those lives.
And that decline was related to better sanitation, better nutrition, cleaner water, better hygiene, etc. And to make the point that vaccines really aren't saving our lives, it is amazing to me that he felt compelled to do this when we have outbreaks of measles, whooping cough, and influenza that is killing children in this country, that now he wants to put out the notion that, you know, vaccines aren't really saving our lives.
So, but these measures, sanitation, for example, probably contributed to reduction of deaths, right?
Yes, it did. In the case of measles and whooping cough, yes, it contributed to it. But if you look at measles, when the measles vaccine was introduced in 1963, we had 500, mostly children, who would die every year from measles. We've reduced that to virtually none. When the whooping cough vaccine was introduced in this country in the late 1940s, we had 9,000 children dying every year from whooping cough. Now we have fewer than 10. So he neglected to mention those two facts when he was showing these charts.
So this is another example of him lying to make his point.
That's right. He misrepresents information so he can consistently try and make the point that vaccines aren't really that important and that what we should really focus on is better nutrition.
So the introduction of vaccines, he would argue the decline in deaths is just a continuation of improved sanitation. Refrigeration, I think, was one of them. I guess that has to do with preserving food, right?
Right.
So how would you argue that the effect of the vaccine is not just a continuation of those measures?
Well, because we had sort of hit a nadir where you would have every year, say for measles, you would have 3 to 4 million cases, you'd have 48,000 hospitalizations, you'd have 500 deaths every year. After that dramatic improvement occurred, it wasn't until you introduced the measles vaccine that you saw a precipitous decline in hospitalizations. And that's the same thing was true with whooping cough. So he was sort of ignoring that aspect. And also,
I'm just going to go back one little bit in this thing because I want to see that.
There are a number of infections, hospitalizations, and that's the same thing was true with.
So I would be interested to know between 1963 and 1980 what the trend and messaging in America was about circumcision, and also what the messaging was about cesarean section, also what the messaging was about birth control, and also what the messaging was about breastfeeding, because all of those could potentially play a role in this change right here. For example, if breastfeeding transitioned down in America around this time, or there could be a reason why, you know, a measles vaccine might work or be necessary in a country where the trend is that women are stopping breastfeeding. Then maybe earlier cases of measles, and therefore more dangerous cases of measles, became more prevalent in America because the trend was that breastfeeding was declining. I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there because one of the reasons why we need to have such an early vaccine schedule is because the assumption is that women are not going to be breastfeeding. And I know that to be biologically true because when we had our first two children in Norway, we were specifically briefed that they didn't even want to talk to us about vaccines until we were done breastfeeding, until the breastfeeding had stopped. Then we can talk about vaccines. And so that could be as late as year 2 And there are no widespread outbreaks in Norway. I know Norway's not a very crowded place, but come on, let's be reasonable here. They invest heavily, like 3 days in a hospital-sponsored hotel with midwives on a pull string in order to get as many people to successfully breastfeed their newborn as possible in Norway. And they also don't push the vaccine schedule unless very specifically you're unable to breastfeed your kid or don't want it for very long. They also in that country will give you a C-section if you don't want to give birth and you want to save your breasts. They will support that choice too in Norway. So it's a progressive country in all the bad ways that you imagine these countries are progressive. Yes, it is. But they haven't thrown out the basics. And I think America has more or less thrown out the basics and oversimplified this narrative to there is no limit to the amount of good that vaccines can do because there is no limit to how many vaccines you can give because it's like it's the perfect medicine, one of the best, if not the best invention in human history. And that's of course absurd. It's got to be absurd because intramuscular injection is just a dumb idea from the late 1800s, and I have at least 20 books in this room that prove it. So something is not congruent here, and I don't think the onus is on me to figure it all out. The onus is on me to be able to show my kids that Paul Offit is just as full of shit as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is, and there's no logical explanation for that other than a national security script. Dang, that is a dunk if I ever dunked in my life.
Whooping cough. So he was sort of ignoring that aspect. And also, more importantly, there are a number of infections that have been dramatically reduced that had nothing to do with improved sanitation or hygiene.
Could also argue that the recent introduction of vaccines for respiratory syncytial virus has had the same effect, right? The same number of cases every year, and now suddenly they're declining.
Exactly right. So once over the past year, now that we have a maternal vaccine against respiratory syncytial virus, and we also have a monoclonal antibody that can be given in the first couple of days of life that decreases the incidence of respiratory syncytial virus, just over the past year, you've had a more than 50% decrease in children less than 2 months of age being hospitalized. To the extent actually that it actually lowered infant mortality rates. That's only from the vaccine and the monoclonal antibodies, nothing to do with sanitation or hygiene.
You also make the point in your column that it's not just about deaths that are prevented by vaccines, but people who survive have other problems, right?
Sure. I mean, measles virus can cause blindness and deafness. Mumps virus can cause deafness also. Rubella or German measles can cause congenital rubella syndrome, which would cause 20,000 cases every year of blindness and deafness and heart defects in children. And also Haemophilus influenza B, which certainly dominated my pediatric residency. I mean, I was a pediatric resident.
Hib titer is one of the worst vaccines that's ever been on the schedule, owned by Wyeth, bought by Pfizer. Lots of data out there, lots of kids injured, just like the DTP vaccine, lots of kids injured. But somehow or another, Andrew Wakefield and Polly Tommy and Del Bigtree decided to make a video about the MMR. It's a pity, right? It's just a pity that they got it wrong. I mean, it's really a pity that they got it wrong, isn't it? It's just a pity.
Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh from 1977 to 1980. When I was on call in the emergency department, I would do 2 to 3 spinal taps every night because most of what we saw was Haemophilus influenza B, which was a bacteria that caused meningitis, sepsis, pneumonia, epiglottitis. Now, most residents at our hospital, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, don't know how to do spinal taps. We have a person come in with meningitis. It's often the interventional radiologist that does the spinal tap because we've gone from 20 to 25,000 cases every year of Haemophilus influenza type B to virtually less.
And here we are talking about vaccinating people against a bacteria. Very, very different. The Hib titer vaccine was actually a very small Haemophilus influenza B bacteria epitope tied to a ridiculously large portion of the diphtheria toxin, which is hilarious.
Less than 50 every year because of that vaccine. Nothing to do with hygiene, nothing to do with sanitation, nothing to do with refrigeration, nothing to do with nutrition, and everything to do with that vaccine.
One virus absent from his presentation was poliovirus. Why didn't he mention the effect of sanitation on that infection?
Well, see, you know this story much better than I do. Polio was a common disease in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s. And then what happened was...
Probably because intramuscular injection of a combination of substances to cure a wide variety of ailments was very common in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I have about 10 books in the room that describe all the ways that an intramuscular injection or a subcutaneous injection that creates a good lump can resolve chronic pain, can resolve all kinds of ailments. And physicians around the world considered the invention of the hypodermic needle and the ability to put precise amounts and concentrations of substances anywhere you wanted in the body with precision to be the best invention in modern history. And so it's a weird thing, right? That they've almost got it, but they don't got it. Houstonic Live out of Boston, Massachusetts. Mark Kulak found an article where Paul Offit can be quoted as saying, you know, the ideal vaccine schedule would all be oral, but I guess for now we're stuck with intramuscular injection because it's dumb, right?
When a child would be born, invariably the mother had been exposed to polio, and only about 1 in 200 people or so who were infected with polio would become paralyzed by it. So many people had antibodies to polio, but never had paralysis. Mostly they suffered a summer gastroenteritis. So the mother would then transfer those antibodies passively to the baby. Because polio was common, the baby was often exposed to...
Oh, you mean by breastfeeding? You mean breastfeeding can protect babies from stuff so that you don't have to give them intramuscular injections when they're little tiny babies? Oh, that's interesting, because when they're little tiny babies would be when they're most vulnerable, you know, during the pattern integrity's developmental trajectory through time. You know, the fundamental principle of biology that all these jackasses are scripted to ignore and instead only emphasize the central dogma that evolution is real because we found DNA and stuff.
To polio early in life. So it was kind of this passive active immunity. You would get exposed to the virus at the same time you were getting antibodies from the mother, which were protective. So the term infantile paralysis was always, I think, an incorrect term. As we got better and better at having better hygiene, better sanitation, now the mother's antibodies would have worn off by the time the child was finally exposed to the virus when he was 5 years of age, 9 years of age, and then you saw an actually increase in paralysis. So sanitation and hygiene improvements only increase the incidence of polio in this country. And so what stopped polio in this country? A vaccine that was introduced first in 1955 and that basically eliminated polio from this country by 1979. Nothing to do with...
That's a pretty funny graph. It looks like polio was just going bananas for some reason for a little while there. It's remarkable, ladies and gentlemen. It's remarkable because, of course, buried in the canon of anti-vax stuff is this stupid book where this lady got on Joe Rogan last year and was going to break the internet, but it didn't happen because she can't say that intramuscular injection's a dumb idea from the late 1800s. She can't say it because she's scripted not to. Instead, she's scripted to say some version of what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was scripted to say. Something dumb, something non-specific, something naive, something that could be used essentially to discredit us eventually. Instead of a meaningful resistance, a meaningful objection, never mind a more useful model that could replace the old one.
Sanitation or hygiene and everything to do, again, with that vaccine.
I wonder if he knows this and he ignores it because it doesn't fit his narrative, or he isn't actually aware of it. Most people are not.
You're right. Most people are not. I mean, what's interesting to me is when I published that Substack about this particular issue, I had a number of infectious disease specialists in our hospital say, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you would always assume that the impact of sanitation is a positive one, but the case of polio, it interestingly was a negative one. I mean, all the positive effects outweigh it, but still, yeah, that was responsible for the increase post 1900 when we started to see bigger and bigger outbreaks in the U.S.
Exactly.
So there are many things that RFK says that are inconsistent. Surprise, surprise, right? For example, he's allowed the CDC to say you can get a COVID vaccine, you could get a flu vaccine. Why would he do that if he says they don't save lives?
I can't imagine to understand how he thinks. I don't know. I mean, if you look at what he's done just regarding one aspect of the COVID vaccine, at the end of May, he stood up and did a 1-minute video with Marty Makary, the commissioner of FDA, on his right, and Jay Bhattacharya, the head of NIH, on his left. And he said, we, Health and Human Services, are no longer going to recommend this COVID vaccine for healthy children or healthy pregnant women. That's what he said. And then he said, it's just good science and common sense.
I couldn't be more pleased to announce that as of today, the COVID...
Now remember, what I'm suggesting is that podcasting allowed them to justify Marty's appointment. Podcasting in a stupid book. And he was podcasting very specifically with two people related to the same network of Stanford, Vinay Prasad and Z-Dog MD Zubin, whatever his name is. They're all one malevolent show, and their track record over the last 6 years reveals them as scripted actors that auditioned and honed their little shtick over 6 years in preparation for this, in the same way that Jay Bhattacharya did. And Jay Bhattacharya told me to my face 3 times in 2024 that he was basically being promoted via Robert Malone and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to the Trump administration and for NIH secretary, and predicted that he would get that job. Told me to stop talking about Robert Malone, stop naming names, and to stick to the biology, in hopes that this would get this far and that I would shut my mouth, that maybe I would be the lab leak gain of function hero that they wanted me to, scripted me to be. But I haven't. I threw everything. I'm all in. That guy's scripted. That guy's scripted. Jay Bhattacharya is definitely scripted. And people involved in this made me meet him 3 different times during the course of the pandemic to try and set me up. Just in the same way they tried to pay me as a dissident for CHD, as a staff scientist under Brian Hooker and Mary Holland, 2 of the biggest frauds in American history. And definitely 2 of the worst Americans alive right now, tried to get me to be behind this fraud, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's definitely a scripted fraud because he hasn't made any intellectual progress in 20 years. And I suspect that Mary Holland and Meryl Nass and Robert Malone have been behind him and his script since they killed Brandy Vaughn and before. Since they made Vaxxed and before, since they recruited Brian Hooker and before. This is as shitty as it gets. And any of these foreign actors that are associated with these people are all part of a NATO-based network or a Five Eyes-based network that is responsible for the controlled demolition of American culture and the American system, the American economy, and the American dollar, so that the most can be blamed on the American dream, the most, so that they can demolish it, maybe even bring in a North American Union.
Vaccine for healthy children and healthy pregnant women has been removed from the CDC recommended immunization schedule.
With these 2 heads of NIH and FDA nodding in agreement. Then what he did was he took that off the CDC immunization schedule. So if you looked at COVID and pregnancy, it was a non-recommendation. Now, more recently, the COVID vaccine is recommended for pregnant women under the sort of guise of individual decision-making or shared clinical decision-making. And so he's gone from not recommending it, putting it on the schedule, and now apparently it is recommended with shared clinical decision making. So it's confusing, and I think that's the point. I think the point is to be confusing, because as people are confused, immunization rates will erode, and that is his goal, to make vaccines less available, less affordable, and more feared. He thinks vaccines have simply replaced infectious diseases with chronic diseases. He says that over and over again. He thinks his mission is to eliminate chronic diseases, which in large part means eliminating vaccines. I don't think people realize how serious he is about this.
What's unfortunate is that one person's view is controlling the narrative now in the U.S. He has, the anti-vaxxer crowd behind him and a small handful of Americans. But I think most people realize that vaccines are important. Just looking at the comments in this Substack, one lady said vaccines are the best things that humans.
Looking at the comments in Substack. So now we have Vincent Racaniello, the preeminent Earth's virologist and longtime vax proponent and expert vaccinologist Paul Offit, trained under Hillary Kaprowski and under Stanley Plotkin. He is advocating for Substack as being a place where you can find the truth, and even in Substack comments, where all these people, or let's say their cyber representatives, interact with all of us all the time. And if you just argue with the right person on Substack, if you just get the right zinger in the right Substack comment section, you might change the world. And that is the biggest bullshit story ever. But these guys seem to agree just like everybody else because they're scripted actors.
Human ever invented. Could be. So how can we let one person dictate this? I just don't understand it. I thought our system was resilient enough that it wouldn't be affected in that way.
So did I. I mean, if you look at polls of parents' attitudes about vaccines, if you sort of set aside the COVID vaccine, most parents, Republican or Democrat, more than 80%, value vaccines, value school vaccine entry requirements. So he doesn't represent most parents, not at all. He represents a small part of very loud, vocal parents that have at some level kind of infiltrated this whole Make America Healthy Again movement. But he doesn't represent most parents, and you would think, since he doesn't represent most parents, and we have people who are in the House and people who are in the Senate who represent those parents, that they would stand up. Because I know that they're getting letters. They are getting letters from parents. I've had congressmen tell me that. Yet still they just refuse to stand up for the health of children in this country because they...
Isn't it funny how all the letters of vaccine-injured parents go to Aaron Siri and all the letters that are pro-vaccine go to Paul Offit? It's weird, right? Because you would think that if you were interested in changing the world, then you would take your case to Paul Offit if your kids developed autism, and you would take your case to CHD if you thought that vaccines were great. But instead, there seems to be this kind of unfortunate agreement that if we have a really compelling story about how our kid was damaged by a vaccine, we should take it to somebody like Aaron Siri, who already has a whole collection of these letters, instead of taking it to somebody like this, who seems to think that it's really anecdotal. Isn't it funny? It's almost like they're on a national security bullshit script.
They value their political career apparently more than they value the health of the children in this country. Until that changes, children are going to continue to suffer.
Let's do a hypothetical, Paul. Let's say that at the next elections, Congress is flipped. Would that have any impact on what RFK Jr. is doing?
I think it would. I think if they have a majority in the House, I do think they will be able to force play enough to at least get RFK Jr. to be replaced. And so you can still have your MAHA movement, about which there are many good things, but not have an anti-vaccine activist heading that MAHA movement. I do think that's possible. But then again, I'm an optimist because, as you know, I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'll leave a link to this column in the show notes so you can go read it yourself.
Substack.
That's Beyond the Noise with Dr. Paul Offit. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Vincent.
Of course, you should be terrified because Andrew Huff was on Tucker Carlson. Why is that important in 2025, in October of 2025? Because a wide variety of reasons. There is an early video with Andrew Huff and Robert Malone, where Andrew Huff talks all about EcoHealth Alliance and the CIA, and they use a lot of lingo like over and whatever. And that's a very damning video. But for me, what's a little more damning is that when I went to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s presidential announcement in Boston on invitation from CHD and was backstage, you know, I was in the third row of that announcement. I was one row in front of Meryl Nass and Abby Rockefeller, and just down the same row from Robert Malone. So it's an interesting place to be. It was crazy, actually, in retrospect. And when I was walking into the hotel where that event would take place, this man, Andrew Huff, about 6'5", so good eye contact with me, came out of the revolving door, side door that I was going in. And in a very revealing, startling statement, Andrew Huff, of course, I recognized him and also kind of came to the thought like, wow, I didn't think that Andrew Huff was so tall. The very first words that came out of his surprised mouth were, oh, wow, I didn't expect you to be this big. So in that admission in Boston in 2023, you know, in November of 2023, the same month that Robert Malone, Meryl Nass, Jessica Rose, Stephen Hatfill, Nick Hudson, and Denny Rancor, and a bunch of other clowns would be on stage in Romania at an international COVID summit. That same month, Andrew Huff met me in Boston at Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s announcement with none other than Charles Rixey chasing him around. Yes, Charles Rixey, the guy that came to my house in January of 2022, about 2 weeks after the health and, you know, the Human Genome Project Research and Development Director, Kevin McKernan, was on my stream. Charles Rixey came to my house. Then 3 years later, I saw them and together at Boston, and he's running around like a little dog chasing Andrew Huff. And Andrew Huff didn't say, hey, I'm Andrew Huff, you're Jonathan Couey, I'm happy to meet you. He just said in one sentence, wow, I didn't expect you to be so big. Which is, oddly enough, the same thing that Steve Kirsch said to me the first time he saw me in person. It's all hilarious, ladies and gentlemen. This is an admission that this is all one show. Hey, Steve Bannon, Robert Malone, Kevin McKernan, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Trump bullshit show. You want to save America? You want to save your country in the EU? You want to save your homeland in the EU? This is the way to save it. To realize that social media has been weaponized against us, and it's not the algorithm, it's not out of their control. It is precisely under their control, and specifically under the control of scripted actors. Scripted actors, ladies and gentlemen.
So I think most people have concluded that the creation of COVID was probably not what they told us. It probably didn't evolve naturally out of a pangolin in a seafood market, and that the Wuhan Institute of Virology probably played a role.
Okay, so I'm going to have to adjust this because somehow or another they have so much bass on there right now. It's hurting my ears.
The U.S. government played a role, but it is impossible to find anyone, or has been for us anyway, to find anyone who has kind of like direct connection to any of the main players here. None of them will do an interview. None. You were the vice president of the EcoHealth Alliance. You're a former military guy, tied to the intel world. You worked at a federal nuclear lab in New Mexico for years, and then you wind up at your scientist PhD. And then
he worked at a federal laboratory in New Mexico for years, the same laboratory where a lot of the sequencing algorithms were developed. You know, that Los Alamos laboratory, the same place where Dan Sirotkin of of Harvard to the Big House that was first published in February or March of 2020 in Zero Hedge and promoted my lab leak bike ride. That guy's dad also worked there. Carl Sirotkin. Yes, at the same place where this jackass worked. And they're just going to state it out loud. Don't forget that in 2021, Tucker Carlson on his own Fox program announced that Drastic was a real group, and it was on Twitter, and they were blowing the whistle on the lab leak, and it was founded by some French guy and Metzel, the futurist. Like it's a joke. And that was also reported in Vanity Fair. At the time, I was actually in Drastic and livid that nobody in Drastic seemed to care that the founding of the organization was being attributed to somebody that clearly just joined. And this was even before Charles Rixey joined Drastic. That's the remarkable thing. This is an extraordinary admission, and I think I'm going to have to leave the majority of this video for later because it's just so crazy, and I'll play us out with chips in a few minutes, but I'll just play a few more minutes so you get a taste for how absurd it is that they can't come off of the script. That's the reason why Kevin McCairn in Japan or wherever the hell he is will not stop. That's the reason why Mary Talley Bowden cannot stop. That's the reason why the lawyer from Grace's dad is not stopping. That's the reason why Brooke Jackson is not stopping, why Peter McCullough won't stop, why Pierre Corey won't stop, why Steve Kirsch won't stop, because they can't. If they do, they will admit that this has been a scripted hoax and that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was part of it, that Trump is a part of it, that it's all just one malevolent shit show. We never elected anybody. Nobody was shot.
You wind up working for EcoHealth Alliance in New York City. You think it's like this World Wildlife Fund operation designed to like track diseases among wildlife globally and protect the wildlife, protect the people. It's like kind of a crunchy outfit.
And they got on 60 Minutes despite 60 Minutes being a awesome, the gold standard of journalism. They were able to fool 60 Minutes into doing multiple specials on them over the course of 20 years. Come on.
Do-gooders, basically. You show up there, you help them raise a bunch of money from the feds, and you become the vice president. And then you discover it's not what you thought. So that's the story that you told me at breakfast, which was an amazing story.
Oh, he only told it at breakfast? You know, the story that I've heard him tell multiple times is that he was in a shootout with who he assumes is the Michigan State Police, maybe the State Patrol, possibly the FBI, on his property in Upper Michigan. And he shot over 150 rounds at this still unidentified group of law enforcement officers who were on his property for an unknown reason. He even ran back to the house where his wife and toddler were sheltering to reload. This is a real story that he told. So if he doesn't tell that story in this Tucker Carlson interview, it will be another admission. And if he tells the story, it's an admission. 150 rounds. He ran back to his house to reload. Those cops or FBI agents, they just left. There was a helicopter and stuff and drones on his property. And Charles Rixey and him traveled together. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the program for today. I will be on tomorrow. I apologize for not being here yesterday. I'm still getting my feet underneath me. And still trying to transition into the new schedule. But I will be more and more regularly on to the point where you might start to get annoyed. So just beware. We're almost there. We're almost completely there. And that's really exciting because that means that these people are in big trouble. Hoo-ha! Gonna see you very soon. We'll just watch the rest of this tomorrow if we don't have anything else to do. So that'll guarantee that I'm there. See you later.